1980, a few months after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Charlie Wilson saw his first news report on the Soviet-Afghan War on 60 Minutes.
How long has he had this weapon?
2 months. About 2 months.
Does he know it's World War I?
They know that these are all old weapons, and they really aren't up to doing anything to the Russian weaponry that's around. But that's all they have, and this is why they want help.
Solely from this report, Charlie called the House Subcommittee on Defense and immediately doubled the budget from $5 million to $10 million. Previous to learning the slaughter of Afghans, Charlie Wilson had stated that he knew nothing of the nation of Afghanistan. Mr. Wilson had decided that it was time for action to be taken, and spearheaded CIA involvement in Afghanistan by doubling the budget through approval of Congress to help the Mujahideen fend off the Soviet Union. Mr. Wilson is one of those people that can really say that they have changed history. He took a stand for the Afghan people and through the process unknowingly destroyed, in Ronald Reagan's words, the evil empire. Charles Nesbitt Wilson was born on June 1, 1933, in the small town of Trinity, Texas. According to Mr. Wilson, he entered politics as a teen running against his neighbor, City Council member Hazard. Charlie Wilson attended Sam Houston State University, where he was accepted into the United States Naval Academy. While at the academy, he earned his bachelor's and graduated 8th from the bottom of his class in 1956. For the next 4 years, Mr. Wilson served in the United States Navy as an officer on a U.S. destroyer, looking for Soviet submarines. Mr. Wilson volunteered to help in John F. Kennedy's 1960 campaign, and while on naval leave, entered his name into the race for Texas State Representative. This therefore violated Navy regulations and was subsequently discharged following his swearing-in 1961 at the age of 27. In 1955, when the United States declined funding Afghanistan's military, Prime Minister Daoud turned to Moscow for military assistance and training. A Soviet grant for $100 million was granted for infrastructure projects. Paramount were military airfield. While Daoud's cousin, King Zaire Shah, was in Italy for medical treatment, Prime Minister Daoud seized power in 1973 with a group of military officers. Zaire Shah's experiment with limited democracy largely failed, and most Afghans welcomed Daoud's return to power. Many saw Daoud as a forceful ruler who could bring back order to Afghanistan, even though he had allied himself with the communists. Daoud's allies arrested hundreds of members of the Muslim Brotherhood, in which many were executed. Following the killings, in 1975, Daoud dismissed all communists from his cabinet, and later his new constitution was approved, which created the presidential one-party system. However, even as relationships deteriorated between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, aid agreements were reached with other nations, such as India, Iran, and the oil-rich Arab states. When conditions failed to improve despite foreign aid, communist groups allied with the Afghan military officers staged a bloody coup, during which Daoud's entire family was murdered. The PDPA called its bloody coup the Tsar Revolution. The communists placed President Muhammad Taraki, in which they implemented new reforms which enraged many traditionalists. The PDPA faced internal dissidents and civil resistance. Soon, President Taraki was assassinated by members of a rival party, and their leader, Hafizullah Amin. Even though Soviet leadership supported Taraki, they were suspicious of Amin, and the coup occurred too suddenly for Moscow to intervene. When Amin went into power, he tried to gain religious support by repealing some of the anti-religious policies. However, this did little to erase hostility among the Muslim population. With the Soviets fearing that the Islamists may overthrow the government, they invaded in the last days of December 1979. Soon after, Soviet troops captured Kabul and assassinated Amin, installing Baruch Kemal in his place. Resistance to the Soviet troops grew quickly and fiercely. Resistance leaders appealed to all Afghanis on their Muslim identity and Afghani nationalism. The fighters who resisted soon became known as the Mujahideen, in a jihad or a holy war. The leaders of these resistance groups had been university students during the 1970s, when they had been organized into groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood. The Soviet-sponsored governments in Kabul tried to build popular support for its initiatives with local tribes by offering food and fuel if they chose to support the PDPA. However, resistance grew further. Mujahideen groups in the mountains had great success ambushing Soviet troops. After these attacks, the Soviet forces retaliated by attacking villages housing non-combatants. In the fall of 1982, Wilson's close friend Joanne Herring invited Charlie to take a trip with her to Pakistan to view the Afghan refugee camps on the Pakistani-Afghan border. Transport weapons. While at the camp, Charlie and Joanne took a trip to the field hospitals, where they found out that when Soviet troops had left an area, they left behind booby trap, toys, and other explosives that children would pick up. These acts of barbarism left many children with severe wounds and sometimes missing limbs.
The Russian soldiers were young and very cruel and barbaric. When they went on an operation, they killed everything and everyone they came across.
President Zia offered for Pakistan to be the center of Afghan resistance, and when Charlie met with him, they agreed with the president to give weapons to the Mujahideen on terms that the U.S. government reimbursed them for the weapons. In this agreement with Zia, Pakistan would be the lifeline for the Mujahideen resistance group, while allowing the U.S. to send the equipment to Pakistani airports. From there, smugglers would transport the weapons across the Afghan border to the Mujahideen. The Soviets soon found out the weapons were becoming more and more advanced. The Soviets also learned that the smugglers used mules and camels to transport weapons, and thus they set out to exterminate all camels and mules in the region. When Mr. Wilson learned of this, he immediately sent Tennessee mules to Afghanistan to maintain the supply line that was keeping the Mujahideen alive. Learning from many wounded civilians about the Soviet Mi-24 helicopters, Charlie decided that something needed to be done because the weapons that had been given could not pierce the gunship's armor or damage any of its equipment. When Charlie met with tribal leaders, they said to him,
"Do not send us food. Do not send us medicine. We can live without food, we can live without medicine, but we cannot live without freedom. Send us guns." Pashtun tribal leader.
Charlie decided that the Mujahideen needed a weapon to destroy heavy Soviet equipment. With help of the CIA agent Gust Avocados, Charlie got the Mujahideen better weapons to combat ground troops. By increasing support of the Mujahideen, Charlie and Gust felt that they could take revenge on the Soviets for their funding of the Viet Cong and the MVA in the Vietnam War. Charlie became obsessed with the Soviet helicopters and felt drastic measures needed to be taken. Mr. Wilson got Clarence Long, who was the chairman of the House, and after some convincing got 10 times the amount of money to support the Mujahideen. Soon after, Saudi Arabia agreed to match every US dollar that went to Afghanistan. With this money, Gust used the CIA's top weapon expert, Michael G. Vickers, to purchase the new weapons for the Afghans. The first advanced weapon that the Mujahideen received from the U.S. was the Milan, which is a wire-guided French anti-tank missile designed to destroy Soviet tanks. These anti-tank missiles destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks and armored vehicles. However, soon after the first shipment, Charlie suffered from heart failure, being very close to dying. His doctor told him that he needed to give up drinking in order to stay alive.
In their War of the Roads, the Mujahideen destroyed thousands of trucks along this vital supply route, causing severe fuel shortages in the capital.
After many arguments with the CIA and a long amount of time, Charlie finally got the Mujahideen the Stinger weapon system, a heat-seeking missile, in September 1986. Within the year, the Mujahideen shot down 100 Soviet helicopters and fighter jets with the Stingers. By war's end, the Mujahideen shot down 333 helicopters and 118 fighter jets, killing at least 2,000 Soviet troops. On the 14th of April, 1988, at the United Nations, Pakistan and Afghanistan signed the Geneva Accords. This treaty deemed a non-interference in Afghanistan from neighboring nations, international recognition as a sovereign state by the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Following this, on February 15, 1989, the last of the Soviet forces crossed the Friendship Bridge on their way back to the Soviet Union. As a direct result, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed on December 26, 1991, due to prolonged conflict in Afghanistan. Charlie was always quick to deflect any credit and point it to those fighting and those in the background.
But the real credit goes to those just unbelievable warriors in the mountains that started out without any shoes, without any guns, and took on what was then believed to be the most powerful army in the world, and absolutely defeated them.
After the defeat of the Soviet Union, the United States funding dried up due to Congress thinking that there would be no need to fund after the collapse. After spending billions of dollars, it was estimated that it would only take $10 million to rebuild Afghanistan's infrastructure and to reorganize their government. This action resulted in the power vacuum that resulted in the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's rise to power, therefore creating long-term problems for the United States. This power vacuum resulted in the collapse of one evil, but the rise of another. The collapse of the Soviet Union was replaced by the rise of Islamic terrorism on the United States' #1 national security concern.